We finally got the debate that we have been waiting for. Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy went up against Derek Lambert of the MythVision podcast on the subject of dying and rising gods, and Michael handed Derek his ass. He handed me my ass too, and I don't know what to do with it. Like, can I bring it with me as carry-on? Will it fit in the overhead compartment? Can I re-gift it to somebody on Valentine's? Do you think they'll mind that it's got a hole in it, or that it makes funny noises? Is that going to be a problem? Michael appears to concede, for the most part, that there were risen and immortalized heroes in the ancient world, and that, sure, this is on analogy with the resurrection of Christ. But so what? That Christianity arose in a cultural and historical milieu in which divine men conquered death, rose to heaven or passed on to another world, appeared to followers, and sometimes conferred their immortality upon devotees, is just a coincidence. Michael uses the example of the fictional account of the sinking of the Titan and the historical sinking of Titanic to illustrate that you can't just say that because something has fictional precedence, that it must therefore be likewise fictional. Derek and I suggested that this doesn't work because we have real-world examples, an actual frame of reference for ships sinking. Thus, fictional stories do not make such an event implausible. Contrast this with stories of divine men who are raised from death and immortalized, for which we have no realistic frame of reference, with the only analogy found in ancient myth and legend from the same general time and place in history. But Michael retorted that we merely pivoted to a Humean argument, and thereby somehow proved his point. We didn't get any detailed illustration of why his dubious analogy still stands, but as long as you label it Humean after philosopher and abject failure David Hume, then you're good to go. David Hume bad, this argument sounds Humean, therefore you're wrong. Bam! We're toast. As Michael points out, appealing to background knowledge, the principle of analogy, and prior probability isn't how evidence works. You have to take these things on a case-by-case basis, and it's important to note that the resurrection of Jesus is qualitatively different from these analogous stories that permeated the ancient Mediterranean world from which Christianity arose. How so? We have early reports of the resurrection of Jesus, like the Gospels from decades later, Paul's letters from decades later, and early creeds from God knows when. Early Christians were willingly persecuted for their faith, which happens in no other religious movements. The empty tomb is evidenced by decades later proclamations of an empty tomb, and the original followers of Jesus must have seen something because we have a creed of unknown origin and a zealous preacher who never knew Jesus that says so, followed by gospels from nearly a generation after the so-called events that say so too. Going by Occam's razor, which says that all things being equal, and the resurrection hypothesis, for which we have no real-world correspondence, is definitely equal to legendary development, for which we do have real-world correspondence, the simplest explanation tends to be the best. The resurrection of a dead man into a super being is somehow the most plausible explanation. It's the least ad hoc, never mind that this argument is itself ad hoc, and it has the most explanatory scope and power, unlike zealous and apocalyptic religious movements giving rise to fanciful and fanatical myths and legends. That almost never happens. Bad explanation. Speaking of which, I drove through Utah on my way from Kentucky to the state of Washington, and I gotta tell you, beautiful state. Those Mormon churches, equally beautiful. And it got me thinking. In practically every account that we have of a divine man, angel, or spirit appearing to witnesses, we deem this legendary, whether Romulus, Asclepius, Jacob Marley, etc. But the appearances of the angel to early Mormons, that's qualitatively different. We have multiple first-hand accounts from actual eyewitnesses, and even after they parted ways with Joseph Smith and were excommunicated from the church, they never recanted their testimony. They had every opportunity and every motive to confess that it was all a big lie, that Smith had manipulated and deceived them. But they never did. In fact, not long after Smith's death, they either rejoined the church or started their own offshoot from it. These men were certain, they were convicted of their experience. What's more, early Mormons were persecuted for their faith. In 1838, the Missouri governor declared the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. Shortly thereafter, a militia attacked a Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill, which resulted in the death of 18 Mormons. An 1838 pamphlet titled Antidote to Mormonism described Mormons as miserable enemies of both God and man, engines of death and hell. Despite persecution, despite violence and death, despite the witnesses falling out with Smith, this religion endured and flourished, and today there are over 16 million members worldwide. Don't concern yourself with the basic principle of analogy concerning the appearances of the angel, the implausibility of any such actual occurrence based on precedent and frames of reference. This is qualitatively different. Given the data, it's the most plausible explanation, it's the least ad hoc, and it has the most explanatory scope and power. Now, Michael Jones wouldn't buy into this dubious line of argumentation for Mormonism, would he? Because just like us, he probably applies the same reasoning, the same measure of doubt based on prior probability and historical analogy. But for Christianity, his culturally inherited faith, he makes an exception. Pretty clear what's going on here. And none of us have to be able to read minds to be able to see it. As a bonus, Michael suggested that the resurrections of those like Osiris and Heracles aren't comparable to the resurrection of Jesus because their bodies remain entombed while they are re-embodied elsewhere. To repeat for the umpteenth time, the earliest conception of Christ's resurrection entailed his being raised in an imperishable spiritual body, not a body of flesh and blood. He had an all-new body, whether by divine re-embodiment or transformation. What's more, his resurrection was originally envisioned as a direct exaltation to heaven, as any natural reading of the Philippians 2 hymn and the sequential passages in Hebrews 10, Ephesians 1, and elsewhere makes clear. Christ's resurrection was not a resurrection to earth in the same body, but a resurrection to heaven in a new body, according to the earliest Christian tradition. So if Heracles or Osiris pass on to another world in a newly embodied state, this is still comparable to early conceptions of Christ's resurrection. Heracles, by the way, had his body taken up and transformed for immortal life, which is why his body goes missing, as Derek aptly pointed out. What's more, the resurrection of Osiris, according to ancient Egyptian traditions, did entail his corpse being bodily restored to life. To wit, Osiris awakes, the god once slack rouses, the god stands up, the god has power in his body. O Osiris the king, stand up. Horus has caused you to stand up. You shall come to your former condition, for the gods have knit together your face for you. The owners of tombs will be kindly to you. The owners of coffins will come to you. They will bring to you your members which were far from you, when you are re-established in your original shape. High Osiris, thou renewest thy youth, forever and ever in thy rejuvenation, Osiris, in the sky. Thou dawnest in the eastern horizon of the sky, thou resumest thy form of yesterday. Egyptologist Eric Horning cites a scene from the Book of Caverns. At the beginning of the upper register, Isis and Nephthys lift the body of Osiris to initiate his resurrection. And per Egyptologist Jan Osman, in Egyptian mortuary belief, Osiris was the prototype of every deceased individual. Everyone would become Osiris in death and be endowed with life by Isis. Isis was the goddess of physical restoration. All her life-giving actions were aimed at the body and its vitality, with the result that the body of Osiris, restored and brought back to life, represents the entirety of the land of Egypt. So the distinctions that Michael makes are dubious to begin with, but even granting these distinctions between various resurrection or apotheosis stories, which there certainly are, Michael misses the point. As M. David Litwa observes, the first rule of comparison is that it does not assert identity. As a result, there is never an exact parallel. Difference will always remain in comparison if the comparison is going to work, and if it is going to be interesting. Consequently, we need not search for an exact parallel between different stories to speak of their similarities due to common cultural conceptions. Ancient Jews and Christians, even if they assumed an oppositional stance toward the dominant Mediterranean culture, were still enmeshed in the ideational world of the oikoumene. No big, ugly epistemological ditch removed them from the basic cosmological, anthropological, and theological assumptions of their time, many of which were simply taken for granted. Such assumptions formed not so much the content of thought for ancient Mediterranean peoples as its framework. They were the loom on which the warp and woof of thought were woven. They formed a set of givens shaping how the world and the gods were perceived. And that brings us to the odd message Michael received from Egyptologist Mark J. Smith. As Smith stated, "I don't think there is any similarity or connection between the resurrections of Osiris and Jesus, and I don't know of any Egyptologists who do." Interesting. Though neither Derek nor myself are necessarily arguing for a genealogical connection between the stories, I must inquire as to why Smith sees no similarity. As Smith goes on to say in the hitherto unshared portion of the message, according to Egyptian belief, Osiris did not rise from the dead through his own agency. He was restored to life by means of rituals performed for his benefit by others. I have not written on this particular subject myself, but I do discuss the ancient Egyptian understanding of the Osirian afterlife in my book, Following Osiris. With all due respect to Dr. Smith, and I sincerely mean that. I genuinely appreciate the man's work, and I will continue to cite him. But they're dissimilar because Jesus rose through his own agency? Has Dr. Smith read the Bible? Jesus did not rise through his own agency. but by the power of God the Father, Ol Yahweh Elohim. So, once again, with all due respect to Dr. Smith, this argument is based on an unsound premise. Further, it's strange that Dr. Smith should see no similarities when he himself explains that Osiris triumphed over death and the ability to do likewise could be conferred upon his followers. He continues, the colophon of Pyramid Text Spell 561b states that whoever worships Osiris will live forever, showing that already at this date, those who devoted themselves to the god might expect to share in his resurrection. As Smith articulates, his life, death, and resurrection were perceived to be particularly momentous in relation to their own fates, and thus they figure more prominently in the textual record than do accounts of the exploits of other divinities. Ultimately, it was not just eternal life, but eternal life in divine form that Osiris bestowed upon his followers. Call me crazy, but that looks pretty similar to me. And I would add that Dr. Litwa's rather sensible explication of comparative religion and how it works makes null the dubious distinction proffered by Dr. Smith in that email. After all, we are talking about common conceptions and analogies, not carbon copies. At any rate, other Egyptologists do indeed see similarities and connections between ancient Egyptian religion and early Christianity, to wit. In the ancient Egyptian books of the afterlife, Egyptologist Eric Hornung remarks on the preponderance of surviving texts from ancient Egypt, stating further, all the conditions were thus at hand for an influence that continued beyond the pharaonic period and into the new spiritual currents of Hellenism and early Christianity. In the Valley of Kings, he also states, it is not improbable that even early Christian texts were influenced by ideas and images from the New Kingdom religious books. And in The Secret Lore of Egypt, Hornung writes, notwithstanding its superficial rejection of everything pagan, early Christianity was deeply indebted to ancient Egypt. In particular, the lively picture of the ancient Egyptian afterlife left traces in Christian texts. Thus, among the Copts, and later in Islam, we encounter a fiery hell quite like that of the Egyptians. We see this also in canonical works like Matthew and Revelation. And then there's renowned Egyptologist Jan Osman, who provides the following. Salvation and eternal life are Christian concepts, and we might think that the Egyptian myth can all too easily be viewed through the lens of Christian tradition. On the contrary, in my opinion, Christian myth is itself thoroughly stamped by Egyptian tradition, by the myth of Isis and Osiris, which from the very beginning had to do with salvation and eternal life. So there are recent Egyptologists who see not only similarities, but actual connections between early Christianity and these ancient Egyptian motifs. And for good reason, because of the striking similitude in both salvific and eschatological ideas, and because of ancient Egypt's monumental impact upon the Greco-Roman and Mediterranean world at large. But wait a minute, weren't Derek and I only claiming historical analogies, not necessarily genetic influence? Whoo boy! Some of these Egyptologists are actually bolder than we are. But analogies mean nothing in inspiring philosophy's loopy lark through the land of logic. Yes, I did steal that from Anti-Citizen X. So you can rest easy, Michael. Background knowledge, the principle of analogy, and prior probability aren't how anyone reasons through these things. Unless they're assessing religious traditions outside of their own.